Hello everybody, Brotherhood of Light Show current YouTube channel, and we're going to continue with our psychedelic music show, and this time we're going to cover the 60s, 70s, and 80s, a little bit into the 90s, and we're going to cover one group in particular that the Brotherhood of Light has worked with many times over the year. The original Brotherhood of Light did a bunch of shows at the Fillmore and Avalon. I'm going to mention those guys, Bob Pullum, Brian Epps, and Ed Langdon, the original Brotherhood of Light guys. And then Pete Rabinowitz and myself did a bunch of shows with the reincarnation of this band once some of the key members left. That happened in the 2000s. And so that band is the Grateful Dead. So let's get on with the show. So here's the show. Grateful Dead members and albums from 1965 to 1995. Okay, they had a 30-year career as the Grateful Dead. So we're going to cover the configurations of the bands. On this picture right here, we got 5 different groups. There was 4 core members that are in all the Grateful Dead bands, and they rotated some drummers and some keyboard players. So we're going to get into that, and then we're also going to cover the albums. Now, I believe there was 8 different configurations of the band. So let's get on to the next. We're going to go into a little bit of history with them on the first couple slides, and then we're going to just rip through the records and the band members. So we're going to start out in 1965. The Warlocks turned into the Grateful Dead, the middle of 65, and they played as the Grateful Dead in places like Frenchie's, the Inn Room in Belmont. They did a bunch of shows there. They did shows in a pizza parlor. They did Mother's in San Francisco and Big Nig's house in San Jose. And from there, so the picture over here on the left is kind of the early Dead, and here they are, late 65, playing on stage there. And so at that point, they got a gig with Bill Graham was doing a Mind Troop benefit at the Fillmore. It was one of Bill's first gigs, and it was with the Jefferson Airplane, Great Society, and so they ended up playing a set that night. So that was the first big show they did, at least from what I can see. And at that point, this guy there's a picture in the middle here with Jerry Garcia and Stanley Osley, the two of them standing together. Now it's a later photo, but it's very rare pictures of Stanley Osley. And so what happened after that show was they started to do these acid tests. And so this is where it's for adults, not kids. So what happened was Ken Kesey, who wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, was down in the Bay Area in Stanford. He was getting paid to do LSD research, where he was taking LSD in a psych ward, and they were examining him, the government, to see what LSD did to people. And so when he finished with that, he was aware that it was a great psychoactive drug, and he decided to put on these events called the acid test, and he picked the Grateful Dead as the band. And Stanley Osley, the guy on the left there with the hat on, was the LSD chemist who made the LSD for the acid test. So they started doing these things, and eventually in 66, they ended up playing the Trips Festival in San Francisco. That was one of the bigger acid tests. And they ended up doing the shows there, a couple shows, other than a 3-night event. And now that what this thing was like really crazy. It had a psychedelic light show, liquid lights, film loops, slide projection. It had teepees with slide projections of Indians and stuff like that. It had, people with their face painted, New Year's dragon, had a trampoline guy, Olympic trampoline guy with strobe lights on him. It had It had Ken Kesey's light show tower with weird recording stuff, and it would feed back the music, and they'd record what was being played and then play it over while they were playing, and then Kesey'd be on the microphone yelling at the audience, and it was just complete chaos and craziness. But the music and the acid test and the light show seemed to be the three things that ended up surviving, and they started doing the dance floor at the Fillmore, the open dance floor, a live performance on stage with amplified music and a projection psychedelic light show, and that became the birth of the rock concert, really, as we know it today. So they ended up, the Grateful Dead ended up going to Los Angeles with Owsley. Now, he got busted by the cops for making LSD, but they couldn't really bust him because they just took his lab equipment. So he immediately packed up. He was sponsoring the band. He grabbed the Dead. They went down to L.A., and they were, from February 6th through late March, they just hung out in this house with Owsley, and they rehearsed. They played like maybe 7 gigs at the most in L.A. area, a couple of acid tests, but it just wasn't as big a success as it was in the Bay Area. So Owsley was making LSD, so they were just playing, and there was this kind of LSD being manufactured in the house, and they were just kind of absorbing it, like microdosing and playing. So that's how they kind of got their chemistry as a band, as a psychedelic music band. So we're going to go on to the next slide. Okay, so now it's 1966, and they get some money from Owsley, and they rent this place called Olampali, which is this house in the middle picture, and they're playing out on the front lawn. It's up in Novato, Marin County, and there's a bunch of hippies and half-naked people on the lawn, and they start getting booked at the Fillmore and the Avalon and the Matrix, and they decide to quit doing the acid tests and just become a professional, rock and roll band, or whatever they were, eclectic music band. And so here they are at Olampali playing some acoustic instruments on the lawn. And then they did about 100 shows in 1966. Now, they didn't have a record deal at that point, but they were becoming a really tight band after playing like 25 shows in 65 and now 100 in 66. Now the psychedelic poster with the bottle of Ripple says Vintage Dead up in the left-hand corner. That is a record from September 16th at Avalon Ballroom. It's called Vintage Dead. That album came out in 1970, but it was recorded in 1966, and it's a great example of the Grateful Dead that year, at the end of the year, and when they were starting to become a really, tight band. So let's get to the next one. So this is the Grateful Dead, 710 Haight Street, right up from Haight-Ashbury. They moved there in the fall of 66, and they all lived in this house together, or pretty much. I think one of them lived up the street, but anyway, so I'm going to get into who the band members are. We're going to go to this top photo on the left here, and Bill Kreutzmann is the guy tucked back in the doorway there, and he was the drummer, and he was like a rock drummer. He was into rock and roll, wanted to be a rock star or whatever, rock and roll guy. The guy in the middle with the mustache is Pigpen, and his dad was a DJ. He was into blues and soul. The good-looking guy on the right is Bob Weir. He was just fresh out of high school, and he wanted to be like a, Chuck Berry type guy, or Buddy Holly, rock and roll. And the guy sitting down in the middle is Jerry Garcia, and he came from a bluegrass background, he was playing banjo, and he also was in a jug band. And then Phil Lesh, the guy with the blonde kind of Prince Valiant haircut on the left. He was a classically trained trumpet player. So he came from a classical background. So you got these 4 different types of music that all kind of turned into this eclectic Grateful Dead mix with this massive influence by Osley's LSD for 3 months up in LA rehearsing. So here they are at 7:10, and on the right here at the porch, and you've got their manager Rock Scully sort of sitting on the left, and then Danny Rifkin in the middle with the afro haircut. And I ended up hanging out with Rock in Lake Tahoe. He's kind of a friend of mine for quite a few years. I've actually known him for 25 years. He's a pretty good friend of mine. So he's told me a lot of stories. So anyway, what happened was they worked out a record deal with Warner Brothers, and they did this Golden Roll album, and they went down to LA in 67. And they had been playing for a year and a half, so they had their songs down. They did a lot of traditional stuff, and so they did all these covers and then 2 originals on it. And instead of like getting into the fine details of recording it, they just decided that they would knock it out in a week or something like that and save a shitload of money. They get a big advance to do these records, so they recorded it really fast, and so they had money to go back and live on and buy cars and more guitars and stuff like that. And then meanwhile, they were playing constantly in San Francisco at these venues that were happening in 1967. So then in 1968, they ended up getting another drummer, Mickey Hart. He's a guy up in the right-hand corner here. And then they got another piano player, Tom Constantin, and he's on the left of this picture. And he's on this record. So they recorded this record, Anthem of the Sun, and I believe they found their sound on the song. That's it for the other one, and that whole side, this first side, is they found their sound. Okay, which they were doing. They were doing these traditionals before, so this was kind of their first original record. And then in March of 1968, they ended up playing on Haight Street. And the story that Rock tells in his book is that they got a permit to have a street fair, but they wouldn't allow them to have live music. And they pulled in with these flatbed trucks where they had all the equipment like nailed down. And they plugged into the Straight Theater, which you can see on the left there. And they played like an hour and a half set and got away with it. Didn't get busted, but, they really went for it. And that's just such a great shot. I just love that picture. So that's the Anthem of the Sun, 1968. And now they are a 7-piece band. They got 2 drummers and 2 keyboard players. Still have the 4 core original guys. Let's get to the next one. All right, so this one is called Oxa Moxa, this album on the left. And they recorded it in 1969. And there's a 7-piece band. And there's an 8th guy up top, but that was taken out in Olin Pauly, that photograph. They still went out there and did some shows out in this kind of, 20-acre sprawling ranch that they had rented back in 66. And so that's a Rick Griffin album cover. And this album, they still have the 7-piece band. And this album is where they started to write songs. So they found their sound on the last one. Now they're mastering songwriting on this one. There's all kinds of good songs. Now, I personally don't like the fidelity or the production on either of these records. But you got to remember, this is early on in the recording career of anybody at that point. So we're going to go to the next record. I really like that one. So released in late in 1969 is Live Dead. And Live Dead is the confluence of the great songs, the great live performance, the jams, and truly the psychedelic kind of progressive period of the band where they were like on fire. And it came out, it was a early 70s album. A lot of people discovered it at that point. And that's when I had heard the band before it actually recorded one of their records, but I just didn't particularly care for the fidelity, like I said. And when I heard this record, that was it. I loved the band. I went and saw them that year in 1970, and they were our local jam band, our local house band at Winterland or the Fillmore. So we were just really lucky to be able to go see the Dead all the time in San Francisco. I grew up. And so next we're going to go to another change of style. Now, Constantine was in the band here, but he drops out at the beginning of 1970. So here we are, these two albums they released in 1970, and I call this their Americana phase, and now they are a 6-piece with 2 drummers and 1 keyboard player, and they've been influenced by like David Crosby of Crosby, Stills, Nash, and then Jerry joins this band over here on the left. New Riders, the Purple Sage, and a couple of those guys contribute to their sound on these records. And the record is Working Man's Dead and American Beauty. And Rock told me that not only they were influenced by the harmonies of Crosby, Stills, Nash, but they actually took voice lessons or harmony. And there's all kinds of great harmony stuff on these records where they actually, really mastered the vocals, where they were kind of rough on the other records, but these albums sound really good. And this is kind of like, you could call it Cowboy Dead. They're wearing beards and mustache and wearing denim, and it was kind of a trend, the laid back country rock sound of California. So, but these are great records, and they're very unique and considered 2 of their best studio albums by many. So, in 1971, now Mickey Hart is no longer in the band, and it's a 5-piece with the original lineup from the first album. And they release this Skull and Roses album on the right here with the Redo the Avalon poster. And it's a double live album. It's got a lot of country, a lot of covers, a lot of rock and roll on it, and it's live. It's a live album. So now they've released 2 live albums. But this album on the left, right above Jerry Garcia, is called Garcia. And then this album on the right, right above Bob Weir, is called Ace. And they're both studio albums, and they both are backed up by the Grateful Dead. So they're really studio Grateful Dead albums. And there's a lot of classics on both those records that you hear throughout their career that they play live. So even though they're not Grateful Dead albums, they're Garcia and Weir albums that have the Grateful Dead backing them. So they're 2 studio albums that came out in 1972. And this Skull album came out in 71. So now they went to Europe in 1972, and they recorded the whole tour as much as they could, and they released Europe 72, and this is kind of a reissued cover, and that's the back with the ice cream guy. And now they have added a keyboard player, Keith Groucho. There he is on the right above 1972. And so now they're back to the 6-piece again. And his wife, Donna, is considered a backup vocalist on this album, but she basically joined the band at this point. Now Garcia well, there's Bill Kreutzmann on the drums. They only have one drummer, and then on this tour. And then there's Jerry Garcia is on the cover of Rolling Stone. He's kind of getting national. They're becoming a national act, even though they're not selling millions of records. They're still like a very popular band in the classic rock frame. And so there's Garcia on the cover of Rolling Stone. So they are getting recognized. So Pigpen is now out of the band. He had health issues, so he had to drop out. And so they recorded these 2 records with the 6-piece with Keith and Donna and the 4 original members. So they did Wake of the Flood over here on the left. That was done in 1973. And then Mars Hotel, which was done in 1974. And they're both really great studio albums, and they've kind of found their sound in the studio, and they're producing some really great music now at this point. And you're going to kind of see this Grateful Dead lineup for a while coming up here. So the Grateful Dead in 1974 decide to take a vacation or a break as a band, and they do a 5-night run at Winterland, which is our local venue in San Francisco, and they record this Steal Your Face album, and it's a double live album. And Ron Pigpen McKerman dies in 1973 of a complication, liver disease. And Osley gets out of jail and had recorded back in 1970 a Fillmore East show, and it's called Best of Bear, and there it is on the left. They released Best of Bear. And then much later in their career, they released two from the Vault, which was a 1968 recording from the Shrine Auditorium in Los Angeles. And so there they are playing at Fillmore East up there on the right. So now, that was in October of 74. They stopped playing as a unit. And then we'll get to the next slide here. So on this page, I want to reference Working Man's Dead and American Beauty were recorded in 1970, the 2 albums on the left. And then Garcia and Weir's solo albums were recorded in 1972. And they're studio albums now. Garcia album, the one with the hand, is basically Jerry Garcia and the drummer from the Dead. And then Ace, the Bob Weir album, is a bunch of members of the Dead pitching in the recording. But the songs that are on these 2 records become classic songs you're going to hear in Grateful Dead concerts for the next 25 years. So these are really kind of studio Grateful Dead albums in my eyes, even though they're just solo albums by 2 of the artists from the Dead. Then in 1973 and 74, they released Wake of the Flood and Mars Hotel. So really, if you look at it, they hadn't recorded a studio album that was Grateful Dead in almost 3 years, aside from these 2 albums. Now, they did all kinds of live albums. So at this point in 74, they end up deciding to break up the band and do solo careers. And so they do 5 nights at Winterland in September of 74, and they make a movie out of it, which gets released in 1977, which you can see here. And that is the poster for the movie. And then later on in the 2000s, it gets released on DVD, and there's the cover for the DVD, that green cover with the similar skeleton on it. So we're going to get to what happens next after they do these 5 Winterland shows and they retire for a while. So they got back together. Now they grabbed Mickey Hart back in the band. So now, once again, they are a 7-piece, and Keith and Donna are in it, and so is Mickey. And they record this Blues for All album, the one on the left. And they also record one from the Vault, which is American Music Hall, and it's basically they play the whole Blues for All album plus a bunch of other stuff. It's a double disc. And it's a CD. It was a CD originally. I don't know if it's even on vinyl. And then they'd played at Winterland a couple times. And then they did a huge show with Jefferson Starship in Golden Gate Park where they played in front of 30,000 people and did the whole Blues for Allah. And there they are playing in Golden Gate Park in late September of 1975. So great album. To me, one of their great progressive rock sounding albums, and got some classic Grateful Dead stuff. Still producing really good songs at this point in their career. So the next chapter here, the band remains the same, and they create 2 new albums. So they started out in 75 with Blues for Allah, and they go through 1979, and they release Terrapin Station on the left, and then they do Shakedown Street on the right, and that Shakedown Street is a depiction of where their studio was on Front Street in San Rafael. Now, of course, they added motorcycle guys and Cadillacs and stuff, but it was like an industrial area where they rehearsed. And so this band stayed together in this formation to 1979. 2 great albums also. Terrapin Station is really good. The song itself is really good. Its whole side. Really nice. So here they are playing on stage. They closed Winterland on New Year's of 79. And then Keith did his last show. They did an Oakland Coliseum benefit show, Keith and Donna. And they went out on their own. And unfortunately, Keith died in a car accident in 1980. So that ended the Keith and Donna era of the Grateful Dead. But they are really great, and you can get that the Winterland New Year's show on DVD. It's really great. So the next phase of the band from 1979 to 1990. This is a long-standing group. It's, once again, a 6-piece, and Brent Midland, the guy in the middle, is the new keyboard player and singer. So they have another singer in the band, and they release this album, Go to Heaven. Then they do a acoustic set at Radio City Music Hall, and they release Reckoning off that recording. And then they do a Warfield run, and they do this Dead set, which is a double album. So they release a couple records, 3 records right off the bat with this new configuration. And then they continue to play constantly on the West Coast and East Coast as a touring act all throughout the 80s. They played hundreds of shows. And in the middle of the 80s, they did some outdoor, football stadium shows, and Dead would play a couple-hour set, and then Bob Dylan would come out and join them, and they'd back Bob Dylan up, and they recorded this record, Dylan and Dead, which is probably my least favorite album of all these albums we're talking about. And then in 1987, they released Grateful Dead in the Dark, and they were starting to become one of the top concert draws in the United States. They just sold out everywhere they played. They were just super consistent. And as you can see, here's the band with Brent, and they're all getting a little bit older and grayer, and but they were great. And then in 1988 they released Built to Last, which is this other record on the right here. And the thing was that there was such a trend of like Michael Jackson or New Wave in the early 80s, or the hair metal, Bon Jovi. But the good old Grateful Dead just kept delivering this kind of sweet, psychedelic mix, rock and roll music that just kind of lived on. It stood the test of time. I mean, they're just an amazing band, that people kept buying tickets and going to, even though they weren't anything flashy. It was just good music. So their last release with Brent was Without a Net. It's a double, a live album again, and it's got some guest musicians on it. Branford Marsalis on saxophone, and then Brent unfortunately died of a drug overdose in 1990. So they scrambled and they got Bruce Hornsby and Vince Welnick, the two guys in the top picture, flanking Garcia and Weir. And Hornsby was with them from 1990 to 1992. And here they are, the three of them playing in the middle here. And, he's just a fantastic piano player. And they actually brought a baby grand for him to play. And then Welnick would play on the electric keys and do like kind of, more Moog synthesizer stuff. So now, once again, they've got, it's a 7-piece band with 2 keyboard players, 2 drummers. But the 4 core guys are still there. And then we're going to go on. This is going to be the last configuration coming up. So here we are for the last 3 years. And they have Vince Welnick, who's the guy in the green shirt. And he is from the Tubes, and he becomes their main keyboard player. And they are doing really well, selling out massive tours across the country. In major markets, they're playing football stadiums. And you can see the last show they do right here. They are a 6-piece band at this point, and the last show they do is at Soldier Field in Chicago, and that's the old Soldier Field before they rebuilt it recently. And I wanted to include a picture of Garcia and Robert Hunter, who is the songwriter for Garcia and the band, who's wrote a lot of the hits. There they are in the middle. And then Vince Welnick, who was in the band for these 3 years, or actually he was in the band for 5 or 6 years, but he ended up passing away in 2006, so we just wanted to honor his passing. There he is, right there in the left-hand corner. So now we'll get to the final slide of the career of the Grateful Dead next. So here it is, and there's their body of work on the left. Couple different shots of the couple different band mixes, and then we have the Jerry Garcia died in 1995 of a heart attack, and that ended the Grateful Dead because he was kind of the heart and soul of the band. Now they've got back together in 2000 as the other ones, and then they got back together as the Dead, and then they did a final show with Trey from Fish, and that was in 2015. And I actually worked for them on a couple of those tours, and I provided visuals for that last show that did Chicago and San Francisco and Santa Clara. But that's another story. Anyway, so that's the end of the Grateful Dead, and they had a great run, 30 years. So I'm going to sign off, and we'll leave one more slide for you just to check out. See ya.